I don't know how far I'd been running. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, and behind me, the scrape of claws against rock kept getting closer. There were two of them, split to opposite sides, one left and one right, forcing me down the slope like they'd hunted this way for years. Long wolf-like muzzles, bodies upright on two hind legs, bent in a way no human legs should bend, eyes flashing green in the first light of dawn. My foot slipped right at the edge of a rock ravine. Behind me was a drop. In front of me, both of them were closing in. Then the ground started to shake. A massive Bigfoot stepped out of the forest and planted himself between me and them. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Today, I want to take you into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness of Idaho. One of the largest and most isolated stretches of wild country left in America, where a man named Graham Kessler believes he's still alive because of something he'd never been prepared to believe in. As always, this story has been assembled and researched from a number of different sources. We can't say with absolute certainty whether what follows is fact, legend, or somewhere in between, so I invite you to listen with an open mind. If you believe that even among wild beings there can be a line between good and evil, leave the word Sasquatch in the comments below. Graham Kessler turned 45 that summer, but from the way he moved through the woods, most people wouldn't have guessed he'd been out of the military for more than a decade. He still had the habit of reading everything in layers. First the terrain, then the wind, fresh tracks in the soil, broken branches. Only after that did he move to smaller details, an unusual damp smell, or the sudden absence of birdsong. His years in the service had taught him that the environment usually speaks before people understand what it's trying to say. After leaving the military, Graham didn't go looking for a steady office job like some of his old friends had. He returned to Idaho, settled near the edge of the huge forest country he'd known since childhood, and eventually found work that fit him almost perfectly, part-time field work with an Idaho Department of Fish and Game Elk Monitoring Program. On paper, the job sounded simple enough. Elk selected for the research program wore Global Positioning System collars so biologists could track migration routes, feeding ranges, survival rates, and how the animals responded to winter, wildfire, and hunting pressure. Most of the data transmitted automatically, but equipment didn't always work the way it was supposed to. Batteries weakened, antennas failed, collars got caught in branches. Sometimes an animal died in a place where satellite signals couldn't transmit consistently. When one of those devices went silent for too long, someone had to go out there and find out why. Graham was one of the people who regularly took those assignments. He was used to carrying a handheld signal receiver, spare batteries, collar removal tools, sample bags, a paper topographic map, and a satellite communicator. Some trips took only a few hours, others lasted all day, because the final signal came from a deep valley or the far side of a ridge with no road access. Graham preferred that kind of work to the days he had to sit in front of a computer entering data. He understood tracks, slopes, and the quiet spaces between sounds in the woods better than he understood any spreadsheet. The Selway Bitterroot was one of the places where those skills mattered most. The wilderness stretched across steep country, dense conifer forest, cold streams, and mountain terrain, where a person could walk for hours without seeing a roof, a power line, or hearing an engine. Many areas had no vehicle access at all. Once you left the last place you could park, you carried everything you needed and took responsibility for every mistake you made. Graham respected that country, but he wasn't afraid of it. Over the years, he'd traveled alone through places farther away, colder and harder to reach without ever having a serious problem. The morning everything changed began with an ordinary alert. Early the previous afternoon, the tracking system flagged a cow elk because her collar had stopped transmitting data for 48 straight hours. The tracking identification appeared on the screen along with the last coordinates, the time of the final transmission, and a lost contact warning. A technician reviewed the device history and passed the information to Graham. In many cases, it was nothing more than an electronic failure, but 48 hours without a signal could also mean the animal had been motionless long enough for the collar to stop transmitting normally, or that she died somewhere with poor satellite coverage. Procedure required someone to verify the situation in person before drawing any conclusion. Graham opened the topographic map and immediately understood that this was going to be a long trip. The last coordinates were deep inside the Selway Bitterroot, more than 12 miles on foot from the nearest road if he followed the safer route. He could shorten the distance by cutting directly across one slope, but the terrain was too steep and several sections were covered in loose rock. Graham chose the longer route, calculated the time it would take to reach the area, the time he might need to search around the last signal, and how long it would take to return before dark. That meant leaving while most people were still asleep. Graham packed the night before. He checked his headlamp, spare batteries, first aid kit, water, high-energy food, and satellite communicator. He also carried a rifle, as he normally did when working alone in country with bears and mountain lions. But, to Graham, the weapon was the final layer of safety, not the first. Experience had taught him that avoiding a dangerous encounter was always better than trying to manage one after it started. He checked the action, secured the rifle properly, and set it beside his pack. Before 3 in the morning, Graham left home. The drive to the trailhead was completely empty. His pickup truck headlights swept across dark stretches of forest, occasionally catching the eyes of a deer standing near the shoulder before the animal disappeared into the trees. Nothing about that drive suggested this trip would be any different from the dozens of equipment checks he'd done before. One elk had gone silent. There was a long walk ahead, a few hours of tracking, maybe a collar with a dying battery. That was the entire problem as far as Graham was concerned. He parked at the end of the dirt road while it was still dark. Early October air was colder at that elevation, cold enough for his breath to show as a thin white cloud in the beam of his headlamp. Graham adjusted the straps on his pack, checked his bearing on the handheld global positioning system unit, and started walking. The first few miles were relatively easy, following an old trail once used by research crews and hunters. After that, the path narrowed until the forest swallowed it. Graham liked the hours before sunrise because the woods carried less interference. Wind was usually light, sounds traveled farther, and animal tracks in damp ground were easier to read before sunlight began drying the surface. He kept a steady pace and didn't rush. With more than 12 miles ahead of him, speed mattered less than conserving energy. Every 40 or 50 minutes, he stopped for a few minutes to drink water, check his direction, and listen to the country around him. A little more than an hour after leaving the truck, the handheld receiver began picking up a weak signal. It wasn't a steady transmission, only a few short pulses that came and went. But it was enough to confirm he was moving in the right direction. Graham marked the location and kept going. That made an equipment problem seem more likely than a dead animal. If the collar was still transmitting weakly, the battery could be failing, or the antenna might be blocked by terrain. During breaks at outdoor supply stores around the region, Graham had heard hunters tell stories about tracks that were too large to belong to anyone they knew, roars that didn't sound like wolves, and upright figures moving through the Selway Bitterroot. Some called them Dogman. Others talked about Bigfoot. Graham had always treated those stories as products of darkness, exhaustion, and too many lonely nights in the woods. He believed in things that could be checked: global positioning system coordinates, tracks, wind direction, claw marks on trees. His military background made him even less willing to react to assumptions. A sound wasn't a threat just because you couldn't identify it. A moving shadow wasn't a target. In Graham's mind, fear usually moved faster than information. By around 5 in the morning, the terrain had grown steeper. Graham was deep enough in the wilderness that the glow from any town had completely disappeared behind the mountains. The eastern sky was still black, but a thin gray band along the horizon showed that dawn was coming. He switched off his headlamp for a few minutes, let his eyes adjust, and stood still to listen. Graham checked the receiver. The collar signal returned, weaker than before. He turned a few degrees and watched the strength increase. The last coordinates were on the far side of a slope covered in pine and fir, still a few miles ahead. If he kept his current pace, he'd reach the search area after full daylight, exactly as planned. There was one detail Graham would think about many times afterward. About a mile before the final slope, he found a line of cow-elk tracks in mud near a creek. The size matched an adult animal. The prints ran east to west and looked less than a day old. He crouched, checked the edges, and found the soil still soft. There was no way to confirm they belonged to the collared elk, but the tracks made him feel more confident that she might still be alive. About 30 yards away, Graham noticed a cluster of branches pressed down toward the ground. He checked quickly for caught hair, but found none. There were no drag marks, no blood, and no sign of an animal carcass. He noted the location and moved on. In an area where elk traveled regularly, flattened brush wasn't unusual. He had no idea that in less than an hour every rule he trusted for classifying tracks and animal signs would start becoming useless. When the first real light began to show, Graham stopped on a low rise to eat an energy bar. He checked the map and calculated that he was about 2 miles from the last coordinates. Ahead, the slope angled down toward a creek drainage, then climbed toward a narrow ridge. The terrain wasn't ideal, but nothing about it was beyond his ability. Graham's confidence at that moment was completely reasonable. He was fit, well-equipped, and had reported his route and expected coordinates before leaving. He had satellite communication, military experience, and years of dealing with difficult situations in remote country. If he encountered a bear, he knew how to respond. If he ran into a mountain lion, he knew what to do. If the weather turned, he carried enough gear to stay overnight. The one thing he hadn't prepared for was a threat that didn't have a name. At 5:40 in the morning, Graham started down the slope. The gray light was finally strong enough for him to see the tree trunks without his headlamp. The Global Positioning System receiver gave one short pulse, then went quiet. He stopped, raised the antenna, and slowly turned to the right. Another pulse came through, stronger this time. The elk, or at least her collar, was somewhere ahead. Then he heard a sound to his left. It was low, brief, and almost buried beneath the noise of water moving through the drainage below. Graham stopped immediately. He didn't raise the rifle. He only tilted his head and tried to separate the sound from the background of the forest. Several seconds passed, and nothing repeated. He thought it might have been a bull elk making a low call, or maybe a bear moving through brush. Graham stood still on the slope, one hand holding the receiver, the other resting against the rifle sling. What caught his attention wasn't how loud the sound had been. It was the distance between the two directions. The noise on his left and the noise on his right had come from places too far apart to belong to one animal moving between them in only a few seconds. He waited almost another full minute. There was no rush of leaves, no hooves moving away, no heavy branch breaking the way it might if a bear were leaving the area. There was only quiet. Graham looked toward the last coordinates from the collar. He still didn't know where the elk was. He also didn't know what had made those sounds. But for the first time since leaving the truck, his usual confidence slowed under the weight of one simple question. How many animals were on that slope with him? He took the rifle off his shoulder but kept the muzzle pointed toward the ground, then continued forward at a slower pace. To the east, the sky was turning from black to a pale silver gray. Dawn was almost bright enough for him to see farther between the trees, and that was exactly when Graham began to understand that the missing elk signal might not be the most dangerous thing waiting for him in those woods. Close to 6 in the morning, with the eastern sky only beginning to shift from black to light gray, Graham Kessler was working his way along a slope covered in loose rock, trying to reach the last global positioning system coordinates from the collar, when the sound came again. This time it was clearer, lower, and lasted long enough that he couldn't explain it away as water, wind, or a bull elk call. Graham stopped in the middle of a step, kept most of his weight on his rear foot, and listened. A growl came from the left, deep in the throat, broken into an even rhythm like a series of warnings. Less than 5 seconds later, from the right side of the slope, a nearly identical sound answered. He took the rifle off his shoulder, kept the muzzle low, and left his finger outside the trigger guard. In the military, Graham had been taught that when you haven't identified a threat, the first job isn't to shoot. It's to build a picture of the space around you. How many targets are there? Are they moving or holding position? What's the distance? Where's the wind? What terrain might block visibility or create an escape route? Graham started doing that almost automatically. The growl from the left came again. This time, it was closer. Graham didn't run. He continued up the slope at a slower pace and tried to keep his breathing even. The signal receiver in his hand gave one short pulse, telling him the collar was still somewhere ahead. He muted the device so no electronic sound could give away his position, then slipped it into the front pocket of his pack and kept both hands free. A dry scraping sound came from the right. It wasn't a falling branch. It sounded like a hard claw or nail touching rock and sliding slightly. Graham turned just in time to see a dark shape move between 2 pine trunks. It was visible for less than a second before disappearing again, but the height made him stop. Whatever had moved through there wasn't close to the ground like a wolf or coyote. The head had been nearly level with a branch that sat above Graham's shoulder height. He reminded himself that the light was still weak. Distance could distort size. A bear standing upright could create the same impression. Then another figure crossed a gap between 2 trees on the left. This time, Graham saw enough to know he wasn't looking at a bear. The animal was walking on 2 legs. The figure stood taller than a grown man, with an upper body longer and narrower than a bear's. 2 arms hung down at the sides but didn't reach the ground. The head projected forward because of a long muzzle, clearly more like the facial structure of a wolf than anything Graham would have associated with a primate or human. When the animal crossed through the gray light of dawn, the rear legs bent at an angle Graham immediately recognized as digitigrade. The heel stayed raised while the body's weight rested forward on the toes, the way it does in dogs and wolves. The figure on the right appeared almost at the same time. That one was tall too, also upright on 2 hind legs, and stayed nearly parallel with the one on the left. Graham saw the eyes when the head turned toward him. 2 green points reflected in the dim light, not glowing like lamps, but flashing whenever the angle lined up with the growing daylight. The long muzzle opened slightly, showing a pale line of teeth. The growl came directly from there, deep enough that Graham felt it in his chest as much as he heard it, and both of them were following him. That became obvious over the next few minutes. Graham shifted slightly to the right, pretending he was trying to work around a slick stretch of rock. The animal on the left immediately moved lower on the slope, tightening the angle toward the path Graham would likely take. The one on the right backed off several yards, then climbed higher, keeping an opposing position. When Graham returned to his original direction, both adjusted again. Neither animal rushed him, neither left. They held their distance like 2 slow pincers closing around a point between them. Graham felt the muscles at the back of his neck tighten, even though the air was beginning to warm. This wasn't the kind of curious trailing he'd seen from wolves. Wolves might follow a person from a distance, watch, then leave once they'd been noticed. These two seemed to be using the terrain to control where he moved. He stopped completely. Both of them stopped too. Graham took 3 steps backward. The animal on the right moved forward too. He shifted left toward a cluster of fallen trees that might give him cover. The animal on the left immediately slid down the slope and blocked that angle before Graham could reach it. By then, his military training was starting to overpower the confusion. Graham didn't need to understand what the animals were to understand the tactic. 2 threats were staying far enough apart that he couldn't focus on both at once, but close enough that any change in direction gave one of them an advantage. One applied pressure while the other adjusted. They didn't need to charge him yet. They were reducing his choices. Graham checked the terrain behind him. If he turned around completely, he'd have to dribble across a long stretch of open ground where both animals could accelerate from the sides. Going straight uphill gave him a temporary elevation advantage, but ahead were larger rocks and narrow breaks in the terrain that were hard to read from below. He decided to keep climbing and look for a large tree, a rock wall, or some narrow approach that would force both animals to come from the same direction. He started walking faster, but he still didn't run. Training had taught him that panic burned through energy too quickly and made people miss information they needed. Graham knew he still had more than 10 miles between himself and the truck. If he sprinted now, he could destroy his own ability to survive within minutes. So he kept a measured pace, breathed through his nose whenever he could, and constantly checked the distance. The growling continued on both sides. 1 sound from the left, 2 beats of quiet, 1 from the right. Sometimes the sounds overlapped and became a low vibration moving through the trees. Graham noticed that neither animal vocalized constantly the way agitated animals often do. The sounds came at specific moments, usually after he changed direction or stopped. He began to suspect the noises weren't just threats, they might be communicating. That thought made the situation worse. At around 6:10, there was enough light for Graham to see the animal on the left clearly from roughly 70 yards away. It stepped out of the trees for several seconds. The body was covered in dark gray-brown hair, with a chest that was narrow but deep. The shoulders sat lower than the head while it moved, creating a slightly forward-leaning posture. The rear legs were long, with joints bent in the digitigrade structure of an animal built to run on its toes. Every step had a spring to it that no normal human gait could produce. The arms were longer in proportion than a person's, with dark hands and curved fingertips. But the face was still the part Graham had the hardest time looking away from. The muzzle projected clearly from the skull. The nose was dark and broad. Pointed ears rose high on both sides of the head. This wasn't the face of Bigfoot from the popular images Graham used to joke about. It looked more like a canine animal, stretched upright into a human-shaped frame. The Dogman caught Graham looking and stopped. 2 green reflections flashed from the eyes. The animal didn't look away. Graham raised the rifle to chest height, but didn't aim directly at it. He wanted to show that he could defend himself without triggering an attack if the animals hadn't already decided to come in. The Dogman lowered its head. The growl climbed in pitch for a moment, then dropped again. Behind Graham, from the right, loose rock shifted. He turned. The second Dogman was closer than he thought, only about 50 yards away, standing on higher ground. In the growing light, it had almost the same structure as the first, though the shoulders were slightly heavier. The muzzle opened as it breathed, sending short white clouds into the cold air. 1 leg stood in front of the other, long claws touching the rock. It tilted its head and watched Graham with those green reflecting eyes. The horizontal distance between the two dogmen was now less than 100 yards, and Graham was almost exactly in the middle. He understood the pattern. Part of his mind went back to old training about ambushes and forced movement. An opponent doesn't need to attack immediately if terrain can do the work for them. Apply pressure from both sides, and eventually, the target chooses the route you already expected. Graham looked at the path ahead, and, for the first time, realized he was being guided toward narrower ground. He stopped long enough to check his paper map. About half a mile ahead, a rocky cut crossed the mountainside. On the map, it looked like nothing more than a tight set of contour lines and a small creek branch. If he continued in the same direction, he'd move closer to the edge of that ravine. Turning south could take him into thicker forest, but the larger dogman on his right already controlled that direction. West was no better. The other animal held higher ground there. Graham's mouth went dry. He hadn't chosen this route entirely on his own. He changed tactics. Instead of continuing straight uphill, Graham turned diagonally southeast, taking a harder line that might cut across the axis the two dogmen were building around him. He increased his pace for about 30 steps, moved between tree trunks, then used a large boulder to break their line of sight. The growl on the left stopped. For several seconds, Graham thought he'd broken the formation. Then another growl sounded from ahead and to his left. The dogman had moved faster than he expected. Graham saw the shape racing between trees, no longer walking slowly. When the dogman accelerated, the upper body leaned sharply forward, and the hind legs pushed off the ground in long strides while the animal remained on two legs. It didn't charge directly at Graham. It ran in an arc. The dogman moved ahead of him, then stopped in a position that could cut off the southeast route. At the same time, the second dogman closed in from behind. That was when Graham felt real fear. Not because of what they looked like, even though what he was seeing had already destroyed every familiar category of Idaho wildlife in his mind. What frightened him was how quickly they adapted. He'd tried a new escape route, and the two dogmen had responded immediately, in a way that kept him trapped between them. Graham released the rifle's safety. The mechanical click was small but clear. Both growls stopped at the same time. The forest went quiet. Graham held the rifle across his chest and turned slowly, trying to keep both directions in view. He knew that if he fired, he had to be certain one of the dogmen was committing to an attack, and he had to know where the other one was. One shot might cause one animal to run, or it might turn the entire stalking pattern into an immediate charge. A full minute passed. Nothing moved. Then the dogman on the right stepped out of the trees, deliberately slow, as though the small metallic click hadn't frightened him at all. He came forward several more yards and stopped. On the left, branches shifted. Graham backed uphill. Both animals advanced again. The encirclement began closing once more. By then, Graham no longer cared about the global positioning system collar. The missing elk, the assignment, his return schedule, and every reason that had brought him into the Selway Bitterroot had become secondary. There was only one objective left: find terrain good enough to survive on if both dogmen decided to close the distance completely. Graham kept moving, each step a little faster than the last. He forced himself to stay calm by focusing on specific tasks. Count the breaths, mark the location, check the distance, watch the footing. But he knew something had changed. The dogmen weren't just watching him anymore. The distance was getting smaller. If you're wondering whether Graham made it out, subscribe to the channel now, because the next part brings us to the most intense moment he said he'd ever experienced, including everything he went through during his years in the military. A like also helps me bring you more stories like this. Now let's go back to that slope. Graham kept moving along the slope with the rifle held across his chest, forcing himself to keep his breathing steady and refusing to let his eyes stay fixed in one direction for too long. The two dogmen were still holding positions on either side of him, but the way they moved had changed. They were no longer standing back and waiting for Graham to walk deeper into the middle. Every time he increased his pace, one moved ahead along the higher side of the slope, while the other dropped lower, keeping a wide enough angle that Graham couldn't charge straight through without turning his back on one of them. He had seen forced movement formations during military training. What made his skin tighten now was that there were no spoken orders, no hand signals, and yet both dogmen adjusted almost at the same time. Graham tried the first route by cutting north toward a stand of older pines where thick trunks might break their line of sight. He moved quickly for about 20 yards, used the trees as cover, then changed direction sharply toward the east. His plan was simple: force both dogmen to lose sight of him for a few seconds and make them relocate. But the moment Graham came out from behind the trees, he heard claws scraping stone ahead. The dogman on the left had circled above him faster than he expected and appeared in a narrow gap between two large rocks, blocking the exact route Graham had wanted. The dogman didn't charge. He just stood there, muzzle lowered slightly, green reflecting eyes fixed on Graham, as though simply being in that position was enough. Graham turned immediately. He wasn't going to let himself stop in the middle of a tightening trap. He slid several yards down the slope, using a strip of softer ground covered in leaves to gain distance. Behind him, the growling rose in pitch. Then another sound answered from the right. It no longer sounded like a simple warning. The noises were shorter and more urgent, almost like a rapid exchange between the two dogmen. Graham didn't know what he was hearing, but he understood what happened next. The dogman on the right began dropping lower while the one on the left stayed above him, forcing Graham southeast. He pulled out the paper map while still moving. The terrain around him showed up as tightly packed contour lines that compressed even more ahead. A narrow rock ravine cut across the mountainside, with a small creek feeding into a larger drainage below. Graham remembered seeing the area from a distance during an earlier survey trip. If he got too close to the ravine, he'd lose the ability to change direction quickly. But the safer route around it was exactly the direction the larger dogman was controlling. Graham decided to try again. He turned fully southwest as if he intended to return toward his original route, then suddenly accelerated as he passed a fallen tree. For the first 10 seconds, there was no sound ahead of him. Graham thought he'd created a gap. Then a gray-black shape ran parallel through the trees on his right, appearing and disappearing between the trunks at a speed that erased the distance almost immediately. The upper body leaned forward while the hind legs stretched into long bounds, the reversed joints creating a gait that didn't look human but didn't completely match a four-legged animal either. Graham stopped and changed direction again. The dogman changed too. There was nothing random about the movement. The two animals weren't simply trying to catch him in the shortest possible way. They were forcing Graham to burn energy while keeping their own positions favorable. Every time he found an opening, one dogman reached it first. Every time he stopped to evaluate, both closed the distance by a few more yards. What had started as the feeling of being followed had become something much worse. He was being controlled. By now, dawn had brightened enough for Graham to see the color of their hair and the structure of their bodies whenever they crossed an open space. The dogman higher on the slope had thick, dark gray-brown hair, heavier around the neck and shoulders. The muzzle projected forward, the ears stood high, and the muscular neck dropped into an upper body narrower than the broad-shouldered Bigfoot images Graham had seen on television. The hind legs were still the hardest part for his mind to accept. They bent like the legs of an animal built to run on its toes, keeping the body high, while the center of gravity always seemed ready to spring forward. The dogman below him was slightly larger and had a darker patch of hair near the chest. He moved less, but he always chose a position that blocked the downhill route. Whenever Graham looked toward him, the green reflections in his eyes flashed through the gray morning light. The dogman opened his muzzle and gave a short growl. The other answered almost immediately. Graham was beginning to believe they didn't just know where the other one was. They were coordinating, and Graham was starting to understand that the route ahead was a trap. He checked his compass. Southeast was the ravine. West was controlled by the dogman on the left. South dropped too sharply, but it was still a better option if Graham could somehow get past the larger animal below him. He decided to try one last time. Graham waited until the higher dogman moved behind a cluster of trees, then launched himself downhill, running faster than he had at any point so far. Loose rock slid beneath his boots, but he stayed upright and covered nearly 30 yards. The growling below instantly changed into a sharper, higher sound. The larger dogman cut across the slope. Graham saw him for only a few seconds, but it was enough to realize he wasn't running directly at Graham. He was cutting the angle, aiming for the place where both paths would meet. Graham had no choice but to slow and turn back east before the route was completely closed. When he changed direction, the dogman higher on the slope appeared behind him again. That was when Graham knew he no longer had control of where he was going. He stopped running. Constant sprinting would only burn through his strength and make it easier to slip. Graham turned so a large boulder covered his back, raised the rifle higher and shouted. His voice carried across the slope. One dogman stopped. The other hesitated for a few seconds. Graham thought the noise and direct posture might make them retreat, the way a strong display sometimes worked with mountain lions. Instead, the dogman on the left lowered his shoulders and produced a series of short, rough sounds, almost like barks compressed deep inside the throat. Then both animals moved closer. Sweat slicked Graham's hand around the rifle stock. He pulled one glove off with his teeth and shoved it into a pocket so he could grip more securely. His trigger finger stayed outside the guard, but the distance was shrinking quickly enough that he started calculating a shot. If one dogman charged, Graham might have time for one accurate round, maybe two if there was enough distance. But the second dogman wouldn't stand still and wait. Graham understood that better than anyone. He backed away from the boulder and continued toward the ravine, not because he wanted to, but because every other option had been shut down. The terrain deteriorated quickly. The pines thinned and gave way to exposed gray rock and low brush clinging to the slope. The sound of water began carrying up from somewhere ahead, faint at first, then stronger. Graham didn't need to open the map again. That sound confirmed what he'd been afraid of. He was getting close to the creek running through the ravine. About 13 minutes after the real pressure began, Graham saw the first edge of exposed rock. It wasn't a broad canyon, but a narrow cut dropping sharply through the mountainside, with nearly vertical walls in several places. The creek below was running hard after recent rains, white water breaking against dark rocks. There might have been places where someone with rope and time could cross. Graham had neither. That was when he understood what the dogmen had done. They had brought him here. The thought changed the entire situation. If the two dogmen had simply been chasing him by chance, they could have attacked anywhere along the route. Instead, they had waited, pressured him, blocked each escape option, and allowed Graham to move himself into terrain where a human being's speed and ability to change direction were severely limited. Graham had seen coordinated hunting behavior before, but the scale and precision of this felt different. It felt tactical. The dogmen were no longer spread far apart on both sides. Their formation was closing. The smaller one moved diagonally left and kept the higher ground. The larger one stayed lower, closer to the most direct line toward Graham. Their muzzles opened wider as they breathed, teeth visible now. Both ears pointed forward. Their arms no longer hung loosely at their sides. The hands lifted slightly away from the body, long fingers curving downward. Graham could hear their claws touch the rock with every step. Their vocalizations changed too. The long, deep growls gave way to shorter, higher, faster bursts. Graham had heard similar changes in wolves and feral dogs when observation shifted into preparation. He couldn't know exactly what those sounds meant for the dogmen in front of him, but the body language was clear enough. The testing phase was over. Graham backed up 5 more steps. The heel of his boot touched a loose stone. He glanced behind him toward the ravine, then looked forward again. The edge was only about 15 yards away now. The creek below was deeper than he'd estimated and moved hard enough that an injured person could be swept a long distance. Jumping wasn't an escape. Moving sideways along the wall wasn't realistic with 2 dogmen only a few dozen yards away. Graham brought the rifle to his shoulder. The dogman on the right stopped immediately. The one on the left took 2 more steps before stopping too. Graham placed the sights over the chest of the closer dogman. Through the optic, the image was sharp enough that every remaining possibility of convincing himself he was seeing an ordinary animal disappeared. Hair, a long muzzle, a black nose, one green reflecting eye, shoulders moving with each breath. The dogman was standing on 2 hind legs. Graham didn't pull the trigger. There was still enough distance for him to wait 1 more second. And he knew the first shot would decide everything. If the round didn't stop the closest dogman immediately, he might not get another chance. The dogman on the left made a sharp sound. The one on the right lowered his body. Graham recognized the posture. He was getting ready to charge. Graham backed up 1 more step to create distance, but his right boot landed on a patch of damp moss covering the rock. The sole slid sideways. The weight of his pack pulled one shoulder backward. Graham tried to recover, but his left foot struck a raised stone. The rifle jumped off target as his balance disappeared. He hit the rocky ground hard near the edge of the ravine. The impact knocked the air out of him. He still had the rifle, but the stock had slipped away from his shoulder, and the muzzle pointed left. Graham pushed against the ground with one elbow, trying to sit up, and saw both dogmen move at the same time. The one on the right came first. The other cut diagonally, exactly the way Graham had predicted, ready to block him if he tried to escape sideways. The distance vanished so quickly that Graham didn't have time to stand fully. He dragged the rifle back toward himself and tried to bring the stock to his shoulder from a half-prone position. Behind him, only a few yards remained before the drop. In that moment, Graham thought he had run out of choices. Then the ground trembled. At first, he thought the vibration came from the 2 dogmen running toward him. But the rhythm wasn't coming from in front of him. It came from the forest to his right. Deeper, heavier. Each impact was spaced evenly, like the footsteps of something carrying far more mass than either of the predators closing on him. The nearest dogman noticed too. He stopped in the middle of a step. The growling cut off instantly. Graham remained on the rock, rifle held across his chest, his eyes shifting from the 2 long muzzles toward the forest. A large branch moved hard to one side. Then came the sound of dry wood breaking beneath something heavy that was coming straight toward the ravine. Not fast, not rushing, but very close. Another vibration traveled through the palm. Graham had pressed against the ground. The 2 dogmen didn't continue forward. Both turned their heads toward the same direction. Their ears stood straight up, and their bodies tightened in a completely different way from the posture they'd held while preparing to attack Graham. For the first time since the hunt began, Graham wasn't the only thing holding their attention. Behind the line of pines, something much larger was approaching. By then, the morning light had grown strong enough to turn the pine trees in front of Graham into clear shapes instead of dark columns fading into shadow. He was still lying partly on his side across the rocks, one hand braced against the ground, the other holding the rifle across his chest, while both long-muzzled dogmen turned toward the forest at the same time. Only seconds earlier, they had been preparing to close the distance on him. Now the attack had stopped. A large branch snapped aside. Then a young tree shook hard. Heavy footsteps moved closer, each one landing with an even rhythm that sent a faint vibration through the loose rock beneath Graham's palm. The third figure stepped out of the forest without any hurry. First came a broad shoulder covered in dark brown hair between two large pine trunks. Then the rest of the towering body emerged, standing fully upright on two legs. Graham had seen grizzly bears rise onto their hind legs. He'd watched bull bison charge through open ground at close range. During his military service, he'd been in situations where the size of another person immediately changed how everyone judged the threat. But he'd never seen a living body built with proportions like this. The Bigfoot stood more than 8.5 feet tall, maybe close to 9, with shoulders so wide that for 1 second Graham felt as though the Sasquatch nearly filled the entire opening between the trees. What told Graham immediately that this wasn't the same kind of animal as the two predators hunting him was the body structure. The dogmen had narrow upper bodies, digitigrade hind legs, and heads drawn forward by long canine muzzles. The Sasquatch stood completely upright. Both legs were positioned beneath the hips in a way much closer to a human stance, with the knees facing forward and the feet planted flat against the ground. The arms were longer in proportion than a human's, but they hung naturally at the sides. The back didn't lean forward like the two dogmen. Bigfoot stood balanced, chest facing directly toward the rocky ground where Graham was lying. Dark brown hair covered the entire body, thicker around the shoulders, neck, and upper arms. The gray morning light brought out an earthy brown tone in some areas, while the underside of the arms and the sides of the torso looked almost charcoal. The hair wasn't shiny, and it wasn't hanging in dirty clumps. It looked coarse, moderately long, and slightly fuller around the shoulders, making the upper body appear even broader. But the face was the detail that made Graham stare longer than he wanted to, even while every instinct told him to keep watching the two threats in front of him. The face was clearly flatter. There was no projecting muzzle, no elongated canine nose, and no pointed ears standing high on the skull. The nose was broad and lower than a human nose, sitting almost directly beneath a heavy brow ridge. The forehead sloped gently backward, the cheekbones were wide, and the lower jaw was strong. The eyes sat deep beneath the brow and were dark brown. More importantly, they didn't reflect the morning light as cold green points the way the dogman's eyes did. Graham could see the eyes themselves, dark, steady, and completely focused. The Sasquatch didn't look at Graham first. Bigfoot was watching the dogman on the left. There were only about 40 yards between the three beings. The dogman on the left stood higher, on the slope, knees bent slightly, shoulders lowered. The one closer to Graham still held the lower position, less than 30 yards away. Both stayed silent for several seconds. Graham didn't move either. The rifle remained in his hands, but he no longer knew which direction he should point it. If the Sasquatch that had just stepped out of the forest was a third threat, Graham's situation had already moved beyond anything he could calculate. But Bigfoot wasn't behaving like another predator trying to claim prey. The Sasquatch took 2 more steps out of the trees and stopped in the open ground, directly along the line between Graham and the two dogmen. Bigfoot never turned his back completely toward Graham. Instead, he stood at a slight angle that allowed him to watch both directions. Graham recognized the position before he even had time to put the thought into words. In tactical training, it was the kind of control point that allowed one person to cut off an opponent's line of advance and force that opponent to adjust before moving forward. The Sasquatch hadn't chosen that spot by accident. Bigfoot was standing in the narrowest part of the ground, between a large rock on the left and the slick area, near the edge of the ravine on the right. The dogman on the higher ground growled. This sound was sharper and shorter than the low vocalizations Graham had been hearing throughout the pursuit. Bigfoot turned his head toward him, and the broad chest lifted. A single roar came from the Sasquatch's throat in the next second. It didn't last long, but it was deep and powerful enough that Graham felt the impact against his chest. The sound was directed straight at the dogman on the left, more like a concentrated blast than a warning thrown across the whole mountainside. The reaction was immediate. The dogman on the left jumped backward one step. One hind foot slid across loose rock before regaining balance. He didn't run, but the space between him and the other dogman widened. His head snapped toward his partner for less than a second. Graham recognized the break instantly. The two dogmen had hunted him by maintaining parallel pressure, forcing direction, and constantly adjusting to one another. Now that rhythm had been interrupted. One had backed away. The other was still close to Graham. For the first time in several minutes, they no longer held the same formation. The massive Sasquatch didn't wait. Bigfoot shifted weight onto the left leg and stepped diagonally down the slope. It wasn't a charge. There was no second roar and no raised arm preparing to strike. The movement followed a short diagonal line and happened so quickly that Graham barely registered the turn of the shoulders and the large foot planting itself directly in front of the path the closer dogman would need to take. It looked like someone stepping into a hallway to block passage, not someone rushing forward to start a fight. The dogman closest to Graham had already started moving, perhaps trying to take advantage of the fact that Bigfoot appeared focused on the other one. He lunged diagonally toward Graham, body lowered and hind legs driving hard against the rock. But when the Sasquatch stepped directly into that lane, the dogman had to change direction. If he continued forward, he'd run straight into the chest and shoulders of an opponent far larger than himself. He twisted right and tried to slip through the gap closer to the ravine. The rock there was covered with a thin layer of damp moss. Graham had slipped on the same kind of surface only moments earlier. The dogman's right foot landed, claws scraping hard but failing to hold. His body shifted sideways, one shoulder dropped, and both arms flew outward for balance. He didn't fall into the ravine, but he lost exactly one beat of movement, and that was enough to break the entire attack. Bigfoot still didn't rush him. The Sasquatch simply turned with the dogman, kept himself positioned between the animal and Graham, and forced the predator to move back away from the slick ground. Everything happened within a few seconds, but to Graham it felt like watching a sequence of movements that had already been calculated. He'd been trained to read how people moved through confined spaces, who controlled the exit, who was applying pressure, who held the blind angle, who disrupted the formation. The Sasquatch in front of him had just done exactly what an experienced person would do against two coordinated opponents. Bigfoot hadn't tried to fight them both. He had broken their connection first, then occupied the path of the one closer to the target. The dogman near the ravine tried changing direction again. He backed left 2 steps, as though preparing to circle around Bigfoot and reach Graham from the opposite side. The Sasquatch didn't follow by turning the whole body after him. Bigfoot only stepped diagonally in the other direction, maintained a steady distance, and blocked the route again. The dogman stopped. He growled, higher and harsher now, then turned his head toward the other dogman as though waiting for a response. The one higher on the slope answered with a short sound but didn't come down. Graham slowly pulled one leg beneath himself and stood up from the rock. He tried not to make any sudden noise. The Sasquatch didn't turn to look at him. That confused Graham more than almost anything else. If Bigfoot was defending territory, Graham was an intruder too. If the Sasquatch only wanted to drive off the dogman, Graham might still become the next target. But the way Bigfoot kept himself between Graham and the two predators made that explanation harder to hold on to. The two kinds of beings faced one another. On one side stood the towering Sasquatch with a flat face and dark brown eyes. On the other stood the lower, leaner Dogman with a projecting muzzle, tightened shoulders, and hind legs constantly positioned to spring. Neither touched the other. Their breathing mixed with the sound of water below the ravine. Bigfoot kept his chest facing the threat, head lowered slightly, never exposing the side of the body. The Dogman growled again, but this time the sound was quieter. If size alone mattered, the Sasquatch could have charged. At more than 8.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms thicker than Graham's thighs, Bigfoot clearly had enough strength to turn the situation into a violent confrontation. But he didn't. The Sasquatch was using the least amount of force necessary to make both predators keep changing their plans. The Dogman higher on the slope tried advancing again. This time he took a wider arc, possibly trying to make Bigfoot turn his back toward the one near the ravine. The Sasquatch didn't fall for it. Bigfoot moved diagonally backward, 2 steps onto slightly higher ground, forcing the Dogman near the ravine to turn if he wanted to maintain his angle. That single adjustment completely destroyed the parallel line the two Dogmen had used during the hunt. One now stood almost directly ahead. The other had been pushed far to the left. Graham saw a narrow escape path forming behind the Sasquatch, leading toward a strip of ground farther from the ravine. He couldn't know whether Bigfoot had created that opening deliberately or whether it was simply a result of where the Sasquatch chose to stand. But Graham wasn't going to ignore it. He began backing away 1 step at a time, keeping the rifle low so nobody could mistake his movement for an attempt to aim. Bigfoot still didn't look at him. Yet every time Graham shifted position, the Sasquatch made a small adjustment too, staying between him and the two Dogmen. The Dogman near the ravine noticed the growing distance. He released a rapid series of growls much higher than before. The other one answered. For 1 second, both lowered their bodies. Graham recognized the familiar signs of a coordinated attack starting again. But now they no longer had the same angle. One would have to charge downhill. The other would have to move around the rocks. By simply occupying the right position, Bigfoot had turned one synchronized attack into 2 separate movements. The Dogman on higher ground moved first. The massive Sasquatch turned toward him, released a second short roar, and stepped directly forward once. The Dogman stopped. At the same moment, the one near the ravine tried to rush around the opposite side. Bigfoot immediately rotated at the hips, stepped diagonally back down, and blocked the route without making contact. The Dogman had to stop hard, claws screeching across the rock. Both charges ended before either predator reached the target. Graham had backed almost 10 yards away from the edge of the ravine. His footing was better now, but he didn't feel safe. He watched Bigfoot and noticed something else. The Sasquatch never completely turned his back on either Dogman. When Bigfoot pivoted, his body always stayed slightly angled, preserving peripheral vision. That was something human beings had to practice deliberately during training. The Sasquatch appeared to do it naturally. The morning light had shifted from gray to pale gold. Graham could see vapor, leaving the mouths of all 3 beings. He could see dust rise when Bigfoot's large feet touched the ground, and he could see the true brown color in the Sasquatch's eyes. There was no darkness left to blame. No flashlight beam was distorting shapes. Graham was watching 3 living bodies in natural daylight, and the difference between them was too clear to confuse. The Dogmen began to back away. At first, it was only 1 step, then another. Bigfoot didn't advance after them. The Sasquatch held his ground with his chest still facing both predators. That refusal to chase made Graham understand that Bigfoot's goal wasn't to defeat or kill them. He only wanted them to stop. The Dogman on the left growled once more, But now, the sound felt more like a warning given during retreat than preparation for another attack. The one near the ravine looked at Graham, then at Bigfoot. Green reflected briefly from his eyes as the head moved. After that, both dogmen began increasing the distance, each heading in a slightly different direction, as though the hunting formation they'd maintained for nearly half an hour had completely fallen apart. Graham kept his rifle lowered. His whole body was shaking, but his mind had become strangely clear. Only minutes earlier, he'd been trapped in a situation with no visible escape. What saved him wasn't some wild display of overwhelming strength. There had been no crushing blow, no throwing bodies across the rocks, and no extended fight. The Sasquatch had simply read the positions correctly, broken the right rhythm, and forced two predators to choose retreat. For Graham, that was the most frightening and astonishing part of the entire morning. The Bigfoot standing in front of him didn't just know he was strong. He knew exactly how much of that strength he needed to use. After the dogman near the ravine regained his balance, the entire situation changed almost immediately. He backed away another 2 steps, long claws scraping hard across the wet rock, then turned his head toward the other dogman standing higher on the slope. The second one didn't give the same pushing signals Graham had heard before. He kept his shoulders low, ears upright, and stared at the massive Sasquatch standing between them and Graham. For several seconds, the three beings formed a tense triangle across the rocks. But the coordination that had driven Graham toward the ravine for nearly half an hour was gone. The two dogmen were no longer protecting each other's angles. Each one now seemed more concerned with finding a way out. The dogman on the higher ground moved first. He backed sideways across a cluster of rocks, kept his face toward Bigfoot for several more seconds, then suddenly turned left and disappeared into the trees. The retreat looked completely different from the controlled arcs Graham had watched during the hunt. There was no effort to maintain position, no pause to wait for the other dogman, no attempt to preserve a coordinated line. He simply created distance as fast as he could. Branches shook hard as the gray-brown body vanished between the pines. The second dogman remained near the ravine for several more breaths. He looked toward the direction his partner had taken, then back at Graham. The green reflection in his eyes flashed one final time in the morning light. His jaw opened slightly, but the growl that came out was low and brief. Bigfoot didn't advance. The Sasquatch stayed exactly where he was, shoulders square, arms hanging low, body angled just enough to keep the dogman in view while still keeping Graham behind him. That stillness seemed to apply more pressure than any pursuit could have. Finally, the second dogman turned right, jumped across a low strip of rock, and disappeared in a direction completely different from the first. Graham heard claws striking stone for several seconds, then smaller branches breaking farther and farther away. There were no answering calls between them, no attempt to rebuild the formation. The two predators had separated completely and left the area as individuals. Graham still didn't lower the rifle right away. He stood several yards from the edge of the ravine, legs shaking from the fall and from the adrenaline slowly draining out of his system. The muzzle stayed down, but the stock remained close to his shoulder. He watched both directions where the dogman had disappeared and listened for any sign that they were circling back. Nothing came except the creek below and the wind beginning to strengthen through the tops of the pines. Bigfoot appeared to do the same thing. The Sasquatch remained still for several more seconds, turning his head from one side of the forest to the other. There was no victorious posture and no sign of excitement. No second round of roaring, no pursuit, no display of strength. Bigfoot simply made sure the two threats had really withdrawn. Graham understood that with a clarity that tightened something in his chest. The Sasquatch hadn't wanted a fight. He had wanted the situation to end. Only after the woods had gone quiet did Bigfoot turn toward Graham. There were about 20 yards between them. In the full morning light, Graham could clearly see the dark brown eyes sitting deep beneath the heavy brow ridge. There was none of the cold green reflection he'd seen from the Dogman. The gaze was steady, calm, and direct. Graham would tell Deacon, months later, that this was the moment he was most afraid of himself, because he didn't know whether the Sasquatch would see him as part of the threat that had just been dealt with, or as something that could simply be ignored. Graham didn't raise the rifle. He slowly moved his finger farther away from the trigger guard and lowered the muzzle another few inches. Bigfoot watched the movement but didn't come closer. The Sasquatch didn't back away either. They only looked at each other for what Graham later estimated was less than 10 seconds, though it felt much longer. There was no attempt at contact. No hand reached out, no nod. No sound Graham could translate into gratitude or warning. Bigfoot didn't behave like a character in a human story, and the Sasquatch didn't seem to need Graham to understand him in human terms. Bigfoot turned his head toward the northeast, where the slope became gentler and the forest thickened again. He walked away at a slow pace, completely different from the fast, precise movements Graham had just watched during the intervention. Each step was long, the feet landing flat against the ground, the shoulders barely moving from side to side. When the Sasquatch crossed a patch of soft earth between two rocky outcrops, his weight left deep, clear impressions behind. For the next several minutes, Graham barely did anything. He stood beside the ravine and tried to get his breathing back under control. His legs hurt from the running and the fall. One palm was lightly scraped from hitting the rock, but he had no serious injury. What bothered him most was knowing that if the third figure had arrived only a few seconds later, the outcome could have been very different. The clearest Bigfoot tracks were in the soft ground where the Sasquatch had stepped out from the woods. Graham placed his hand beside one print to estimate the size. It was far longer than his boot, with a broad heel and an overall structure that looked remarkably human, only on a much larger scale. 5-toe impressions weren't perfectly sharp, but they were distinct enough to separate from one another. There were no claw marks. The tracks were spaced far apart and followed a stable, two-legged line. Near the edge of the ravine, Graham found a completely different set of prints. The Dogman tracks were longer and narrower, with a tighter front section and obvious claw marks driven into the dirt and moss. The heel didn't print flat the way Bigfoot's did. In several places, most of the pressure was concentrated toward the front of the foot, matching the digitigrade structure Graham had seen. One track line ran parallel to the ravine before changing direction sharply at the place where the Dogman had lost his footing. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Graham remembered the reason he'd been there in the first place. The cow elk's global positioning system collar was still somewhere farther into the forest, but he had no intention of continuing the assignment. He activated his satellite communicator and sent a short message saying he'd encountered a dangerous situation, had to change his route, and would return by a safer line. The trip out didn't happen in one day the way he'd planned. The pursuit had pushed Graham far from his original route, and he had no intention of moving through the area where the two Dogmen had disappeared. He chose a longer route over higher ground, accepting several extra miles. By afternoon, exhaustion and fading light convinced him to make a temporary camp rather than keep moving in the dark. Graham barely slept that night. Every broken branch made his hand move toward the rifle. Twice, he heard distant noises somewhere along the slope, but couldn't identify the source. There were no paired growls and no green eyes outside the firelight. Even so, he kept the fire small and sat with his back against a tree until almost dawn. The next day, Graham moved slowly and carefully. He avoided deep cuts in the terrain, chose more open ground whenever possible, and checked behind him often. By afternoon, the satellite communicator found a stronger connection. and he sent updated coordinates. A rescue team was notified, but Graham reported that he could still move under his own power, so they agreed to meet at an access point near a ranger station. Near midday on the second day after the encounter, Graham finally saw the roof of a ranger facility through the trees. By the time he reached it, he was exhausted. His clothing was covered in mud, and he had almost no energy left to explain what had happened. Ranger Nadia Solberg, who led the regional rescue team, was the one who received him. Nadia knew Graham from earlier field operations and knew he wasn't someone who exaggerated. The first thing she did was check his physical condition, hydration level, and any injuries that might affect his ability to think clearly. Graham was mildly dehydrated, had several scrapes and bruises from the fall, but he was alert, oriented to time and place, and showed no signs of a head injury. When Nadia asked why he'd abandoned the assignment, Graham initially said only that 2 unidentified large animals had pursued him and that a third large being had appeared. Nadia asked for coordinates. Graham handed over the Global Positioning System unit, his phone, and the photographs he'd taken. The track images were what convinced her to send a small team back to the site instead of dismissing the event as a wildlife misidentification in poor light. The survey team later reached the area around the ravine and confirmed the terrain Graham had described. Wind had softened many of the tracks, but several remained clear enough to distinguish 2 very different types. The report noted one set of large, broad tracks with a structure resembling a human foot and arranged in a 2-legged walking pattern. The other set was narrower, showed claw impressions at the front, and had a distinctly different shape. Nobody on the team made an official conclusion about what had left them. Nadia was especially careful in her report. She wrote that the site contained tracks from multiple, unidentified large animals. But the condition of the ground and the amount of time that had passed didn't allow reliable species identification. The report also confirmed that the track locations matched Graham's description of the movement around the ravine. The elk collar was later found by another team more than a mile from that area. It had slipped off the animal and become trapped beneath a fallen tree, which explained the missing signal. The cow elk was identified again several weeks later and was still alive. That detail sometimes made Graham think about the strange irony of the entire trip. He had walked more than 12 miles into the wilderness because of a failed piece of equipment and had nearly never come back because of something that didn't appear on any tracking system. Graham didn't tell the full story publicly at first. He knew the reaction he would get, and he needed time himself to sort through what he'd seen. The first person he eventually told everything to was Deacon Marsh, an old friend who had served with him in the military. That conversation happened several months later. Deacon didn't laugh when Graham described the 2 dogmen. He asked about distances, approach angles, and the way Bigfoot had moved. Those questions helped Graham understand what had stayed with him most strongly from that morning. It wasn't the teeth, the green eyes, or the growling behind him. What Graham couldn't forget was the way the third being had read the entire situation within seconds. Bigfoot saw 2 attackers working together, disrupted the rhythm of one, blocked the angle of the other, and used the slick rock itself to force a predator into losing an advantage. The Sasquatch didn't use any more force than necessary. Graham told Deacon that if he had to put a name to what he witnessed, he wouldn't call it a fight. It felt more like an intervention by someone who already understood the opponents. The way Bigfoot controlled angles, refused to pursue, and left as soon as the danger ended gave Graham an uncomfortable feeling that this might not have been the first time the Sasquatch had dealt with those predators. And if that was true, then the question wasn't why Bigfoot was strong enough to save Graham. The question was how Bigfoot knew exactly what to do. I want to end tonight's story with 2 different ways of looking at the moment Graham Kessler was trapped beside that ravine. The first explanation is easy to understand. A larger, stronger being appeared at exactly the right time, stepped between Graham and two predators, and made them retreat. Seen that way, this is a familiar story about physical advantage. That explanation isn't unreasonable. Graham described the Sasquatch as standing more than 8.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a massive frame. The two dogmen had the advantage of position and coordination, but suddenly they were facing a much larger opponent, standing directly between them and Graham. Maybe they withdrew simply because they understood that continuing would cost too much. But the second way of looking at it is what makes the story hard to forget. Bigfoot didn't charge both dogmen. The Sasquatch didn't roar constantly, didn't chase them, and didn't try to prove he was stronger. He did one thing first. He broke their rhythm. One short roar directed at the dogman on the left made that animal step back. It was only a small interruption, but it was enough to throw off the hunting the two dogmen had maintained. Immediately afterward, Bigfoot stepped diagonally into the attack path of the other one and forced him to change direction on slick rock. No major collision was necessary. Bigfoot only had to be in the right place at the right moment. Graham recognized that because of his military training. In a high-pressure situation, position can matter more than strength. Blocking one route can be more effective than charging an opponent. Breaking a group's timing can matter more than defeating each individual. What Graham couldn't forget was how quickly the Sasquatch seemed to understand those principles. So, the two explanations sit beside each other. One says the dogmen ran because Bigfoot was larger. The other says they ran because Bigfoot knew how to remove their advantage. Maybe both are true. Strength gave the Sasquatch the ability to intervene, but tactics determined how that strength was used. When we imagine being stronger than ourselves, we usually think about muscle, teeth, height, roaring, and the ability to destroy things. But a huge body is only frightening up to a point. A huge body that can observe, exercise restraint, and understand exactly where to apply pressure changes the way we think about intelligence itself. One detail says more about that than anything else. When the two dogmen began retreating, Bigfoot didn't chase them. The Sasquatch didn't turn the rescue into a reverse hunt. He didn't keep applying pressure once the threat was over. Bigfoot remained still, watched until he was sure both predators had left the area, looked at Graham for a few seconds, then walked away in another direction. That is the part that is difficult to explain as simple aggression. If the goal was dominance, why stop at exactly that point? If the goal was territorial defense, why didn't Graham become the next target? If the goal was fighting, why didn't Bigfoot pursue two opponents already in retreat? We don't have certain answers, but the absence of those actions matters just as much as the things the Sasquatch did. Sometimes knowing when to stop says more about intelligence than knowing how to attack. And that is where the two voices in my own head keep arguing. One says we may be reading too much meaning into a few chaotic seconds in the wilderness. A large being appeared, two smaller predators realized they were at a disadvantage, and they ran. That could be the whole story. The other voice asks why every movement seemed just precise enough, why Bigfoot never used more strength than necessary, and why the intervention ended the moment Graham had a safe route away. I don't think we need to force ourselves into one absolute answer. There's still a space between what was witnessed and what can be proven, and that space is exactly why I think Graham's story remains worth discussing long after he left those mountains. But if his account reflects what happened, then the most important part isn't that a Bigfoot was strong enough to make two dogmen retreat. It's the possibility that the Sasquatch understood the situation, read the terrain, and intervened with only the minimum force required. So which interpretation makes more sense to you? Do you think Graham survived mainly because a stronger being appeared, or because that being knew how to break apart an organized hunt with precise tactics. Leave strength or tactics in the comments and tell me which detail led you there. Whichever explanation you choose, Graham carried one thought out of those woods with him. The Sasquatch beside that ravine didn't only seem to know what he could do. Bigfoot seemed to know exactly how far he needed to go. Remember, the most dangerous thing in the forest was never the size of the creature. It was the fact that it knew exactly what it was doing. I am Victor, and I will see you in the next story.